Hello, ladies and gentlemen. To my commentary, the story begins not with a dramatic public announcement, but with a quiet sentence buried deep inside an internal European Commission memo, one that, according to Caliber AZ, later confirmed by the Financial Times, has the potential to reorder the entire geopolitical architecture of Europe, Brussels, legal advisors, after months of combing through the dense fabric of EU law, claim to have identified a rarely cited clause that allows the Union, in moments of severe economic disturbance, to take extraordinary decisions without the unanimous consent of member states. In the sterile world of legal treaties, this is nothing less than a tectonic shift because it means the EU might be able to permanently freeze and potentially collateralize Russia's 210 billion in sovereign assets held within European institutions. The revelation struck like a silent earthquake across the corridors of the Berlaymont. For years, the entire European sanctions regime depended on a fragile but sacred rule, unanimity. Any single state, Belgium included, could block the renewal of freezing measures every 6 months. But overnight, that leverage appears to have evaporated. And suddenly, what had once been a temporary freeze now threatens to calcify into a perpetual lock, binding Russia's financial reserves inside Europe indefinitely. Within the Commission, officials defend this dramatic interpretation as a necessary shield against economic destabilization should Ukraine's finances collapse. But beneath the technocratic language lies a deeply political calculation. Europe is exhausted, Ukraine is bleeding, and the treasury in Kiev cannot survive without new capital injections. Thus, Germany, France, and Italy, together responsible for more than 110 billion in potential guarantees, are asked to shoulder a historic burden to keep Ukraine solvent. Yet the real drama is philosophical, not fiscal. If Europe truly deploys this clause, it will not merely freeze Russian assets, it will redraw the very boundaries of sovereign financial immunity that have governed global capitalism for generations. In a single stroke, the EU transforms from custodian to arbiter, from neutral banker to geopolitical combatant. Belgium's resistance began not with fiery speeches or sweeping declarations, but with a calm, almost understated assertion: Europe cannot rewrite the foundational principles of sovereign immunity merely because the geopolitical winds have turned bitter. Yet beneath Belgium's measured tone lies a profound alarm, an alarm that Brussels' own financial infrastructure, particularly the globally entrenched clearing giant Euroclear, now stands at the epicenter of a legal and moral confrontation that could determine whether Europe remains a trusted guardian of the world's reserves or becomes perceived as a political actor willing to weaponize custodial assets whenever necessity dictates. Belgian officials insist their stance is not ideological obstruction, but a sober recognition of the consequences. If the EU uses the newly discovered treaty clause to bypass unanimity and prolong the freeze indefinitely, it risks setting a precedent so far-reaching that every central bank from Riyadh to Singapore will begin to question whether their reserves are truly safe in European hands. Belgium argues quietly, but with a trembling conviction that once the sanctity of sovereign financial deposits is compromised, the damage cannot be undone, no matter how righteous the immediate cause may appear. Yet Belgium's principled stand quickly runs headfirst into the machinery of European realpolitik. In private conversations, German and French diplomats remind Brussels that this is not merely about law or precedent, but about Europe's survival in a conflict reshaping the continent's security architecture, they argue that Ukraine's financial collapse would unleash risks far more severe than the reputational consequences of extraordinary measures. Italy, burdened by its own fragile economy, nevertheless aligns with the emerging majority, recognizing that hesitation could fracture the Union at its most vulnerable moment. This pressure places Belgium in an excruciating bind. It hosts Euroclear, whose vaults contain the bulk of Russia's immobilized sovereign assets, yet it increasingly lacks the political leverage to influence what happens to those reserves. The very institution that makes Belgium indispensable also places it in the crossfire of the continent's fiercest legal and geopolitical battle in decades. As debates intensify, Belgium seeks to establish a protective buffer demanding strict legal assurances, compensation mechanisms, and oversight provisions. But the momentum is against it. The invocation of the severe economic disturbance clause effectively neuters Belgium's veto power, reducing its opposition to a symbolic protest rather than a structural barrier. The European Commission insists, almost with academic precision, that what it seeks to do is not seizure but utilization, a subtle linguistic maneuver meant to preserve the illusion that Europe still respects the centuries-old doctrine of sovereign immunity. Yet the deeper one looks into this distinction, the more fragile and illusory it becomes. The reality is that the moment frozen Russian assets are pledged as collateral for Ukraine's emergency loans, the psychological boundary separating a temporary freeze from a de facto confiscation begins to collapse inch by inch, precedent by precedent. For years, European leaders defended their sanctions framework on a simple principle: sovereign reserves, even those belonging to adversarial governments, were off limits unless the United Nations Security Council explicitly authorized intervention. But with Russia holding veto power at that very council, Europe now finds itself drifting into legally uncharted waters, an arena where the familiar guardrails of international law no longer offer clarity or protection. And it is here, in this uncertain zone between legality and necessity, that the true drama of the moment unfolds. The Commission's logic is straightforward, yet perilously bold. Ukraine urgently requires financing. Western treasuries are exhausted, and public patience for endless aid is evaporating. Therefore, Europe must find liquidity elsewhere. And where better than the 210 billion sitting immobilized in Euroclear's custodial labyrinth, a sum whose sheer scale could bankroll Ukraine's survival well into the next decade. The question is not whether the money exists, it is who has the legitimate authority to repurpose it. This is why the Commission is so careful to avoid terms like appropriation. Instead, it proposes a structure in which the assets remain technically untouched, while the value they represent serves as the security underpinning vast new loans to Kyiv. Critics argue that this is wordplay, a semantic shield disguising the fact that Europe would be leveraging Russian wealth for strategic ends. Supporters counter that Russia forfeited moral protection when it launched its invasion, but beneath the legal debate lies a geopolitical tremor if Europe proceeds. It will signal to every government on earth that Western financial institutions are no longer neutral custodians, but active participants in global power struggles. This perception, once formed, could not be undone through press statements or diplomatic reassurances. Trust, once fractured, tends to scatter like glass. Still, the momentum is unmistakable. The Commission understands that once the mechanism is implemented, even in its mildest form, Europe will cross a threshold from which there is no graceful retreat. Interest earned on the frozen assets may be diverted next. Then partial guarantees may evolve into direct appropriations. The slope is gradual, but unmistakably downward. The Kremlin's reaction, when it finally arrived, was not delivered in the restrained diplomatic cadence one might expect from a major power addressing a legal dispute. It came instead with the unmistakable timbre of a nation that believes it has been robbed in broad daylight under the guise of regulatory procedure. Russian officials declared that the European Union's intent to use immobilized sovereign assets as collateral for Ukraine's loans constituted nothing less than financial aggression, a hostile act comparable to direct participation in the war itself. With that single statement, Moscow signaled that Europe had crossed a strategic red line, one from which neither side could easily retreat. From the corridors of the Russian Ministry of Finance to the austere boardrooms of the central bank, contingency plans long drafted, often dismissed as too drastic, began to resurface. The first and most immediate form of retaliation under consideration was the nationalization of Western corporate assets still operating inside Russia. A vast pool valued by independent analysts at more than $250, $300 billion. Many of these companies had been attempting to exit the Russian market, but were trapped in bureaucratic limbo. Moscow now viewed them not as economic partners, but as convenient targets of reciprocal leverage. Simultaneously, Russia threatened to sever the remaining threads of energy and mineral cooperation with Europe. Although gas flows had already been heavily reduced, Russia still supplied critical materials, uranium for nuclear reactors, rare metals essential to European industry, fertilizers that underpin global agriculture. The Kremlin intimated that these supply lines could be throttled, rerouted, or terminated outright, a warning aimed not at punishing Europe abstractly, but at squeezing specific sectors whose political influence could destabilize EU unity from within. Yet retaliation was not confined to economics. On the diplomatic front, Russia began reclassifying EU institutions as unfriendly entities, a designation that opens the legal door to restricting operations, imposing punitive taxes, or outright expelling European missions. State media amplified narratives portraying the EU as a faithless custodian of global capital, framing the asset freeze as proof that Western financial systems are inherently politicized and cannot be trusted as neutral repositories of capital. At the same time, Moscow accelerated its strategic pivot eastward and southward. Discussions with China, India, and the broader BRICS community intensified around expanding non-Western financial networks, alternative payment systems, commodity exchanges denominated in non-dollar currencies, and new sovereign reserve arrangements insulated from Western sanctions. Russia positioned itself as a cautionary tale for the global South. If they can seize our reserves today, they can seize yours tomorrow. The long-term risk for Europe is not merely Russian retaliation, but a gradual erosion of global confidence in the Western custodial architecture that underpins trillions of dollars in sovereign assets. In attempting to defend Ukraine, Europe may inadvertently accelerate the fragmentation of the international financial order. For months, Washington had treated the frozen Russian reserves not merely as a punitive instrument, but as a crucial piece of diplomatic leverage, a card to be played at the decisive moment of negotiation. when the war in Ukraine would inch toward an uneasy settlement. American policymakers, steeped in decades of strategic bargaining, envisioned the assets as a pressure valve, something to be released incrementally, traded for concessions, or deployed as a stabilizing fund during the post-war reconstruction. So when Brussels signaled that it had discovered a legal mechanism allowing the EU to bypass unanimity and effectively lock the Russian assets into permanent immobility, the United States reacted with a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and mounting apprehension. Senior officials in Washington warned privately that Europe's decision risked undermining not only Western unity, but the very architecture of international crisis diplomacy. The U.S. argument was blunt. If the assets are spent or even pledged before negotiations begin, the West will have forfeited one of its most potent bargaining chips. In the intricate calculus of peacemaking, leverage is not a luxury. It is the currency that determines outcomes. And from the American perspective, Europe was preparing to burn a rare and irreplaceable geopolitical asset in the name of short-term liquidity. Yet Europe, compelled by geography, war fatigue, and immediate financial urgency, refused to bend. European leaders insisted that they were not acting recklessly, but responding to an existential threat unfolding on their own continent. For them, Ukraine's imminent fiscal collapse was not a distant strategic concern. It was a crisis with direct implications for European security, migration patterns, energy stability, and political cohesion. Brussels framed its move as an act of necessity. The United States is 6,000 kilometers away. Europe is living inside the consequences. This divergence in worldview marks the beginning of a subtle but profound transatlantic split. While Washington fears the precedent of weaponizing sovereign reserves without unanimity or a UN mandate, Europe argues that sovereignty itself has already been shattered by Russia's invasion, and that extraordinary violations require extraordinary responses. The clash is not merely legal, it is philosophical, rooted in different understandings of time, risk, and responsibility. Behind closed doors, American diplomats expressed dismay that Europe's newfound legal creativity could destabilize global trust in Western financial systems, inadvertently aiding the long-term ambitions of Russia and China to build alternative economic blocs. Publicly, however, the United States treads carefully, unwilling to broadcast discord with its closest allies during a war that demands consistent messaging. And yet, the fracture is there, quiet but deepening. For the first time since the Iraq War, the strategic instincts of Washington and Brussels appear to be diverging, shaped by different geographies, fears, and visions of the future international order. As the episode closes, one is left with a haunting realization. In attempting to rescue Ukraine from financial ruin, Europe may have accelerated a transformation in global geopolitics, one that redraws alliances, reshapes financial governance, and redefines the nature of power in an increasingly unstable world. The question that lingers, unsettling and unresolved, is whether the West's unity can survive the strain of a crisis in which even its closest partners no longer share the same definitions of strategy, necessity, or justice. Thank you for watching.